According to a source, the search of Mar-a-Lago came after authorities believe the former president or his team failed to return materials that were government property, and it was believed the documents had national security implications. Now, the search warrant pertained to both the handling of classified documents and the Presidential Records Act. The law was established after President Nixon's Watergate scandal to ensure that presidential records are the property of the U.S. government and not held as private property. Now, in another historical parallel, the Mar-a-Lago search came on the 48th anniversary of Nixon's resignation. Meantime, in a statement yesterday, the former president proceeded to kind of mangle Watergate history. Quoting now, "What is the difference," he said, "between this and Watergate, where operatives broke into the Democrat National Committee? Here in reverse, Democrats broke into the home of the 45th President of the United States." Joining me now is journalist and co-author of All the President's Men, the definitive account of the Watergate scandal, Carl Bernstein, who's also a CNN political analyst, also CNN contributor, former Nixon White House counsel John Dean. Carl, what is your reaction, first of all, to the search and what you're hearing from people in the former president's orbit?
Well, the first thing is this is a deadly serious matter. In the view of even former top officials of the Trump administration, I spoke today to one of the senior most intelligence officials throughout the Trump presidency. And the point he made, without knowing what these materials are, is that it's virtually impossible, in his view, that the FBI and the Justice Department would take this action without knowledge or belief that the materials contain the most sensitive national security information of real magnitude, that this could not be done unless there was reason to believe that the national security could be grievously injured if these documents got out. It's not just in this person's view, but it's speculative, that this would be about the lawyers not being totally truthful, but rather not being truthful, or that there is knowledge that the government now has that what is being withheld is of serious, serious importance.
John, was this a reverse Watergate break-in, as the former president was saying?
Not even close, Anderson. This was authorized. It was an authorized court proceeding to search and seize materials. And obviously, as Carl says, they were important materials. The Watergate was a bungled break-in by a bunch of actually clowns, in a way, in their effort to get into the Democratic National Committee and repair a bug and take some photographs after having been earlier in the Democratic National Committee. Very different parallels. And Trump, referring to Watergate, of course, focuses on the break-in. And Watergate became so much more than a bungled break-in. It became a cover-up. It became an abuse of power by a president.
And Carl, how does the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland compare to what was happening in the Department of Justice during Watergate?
I think that they're both very principled, and leaders in the Justice Department, after Nixon fired in the Saturday Night Massacre, he fired the leaders of the Justice Department. And those leaders were pursuing the case against Nixon with great independence. Similarly, Merrick Garland here is trying to follow, as far as we know, where the leads go with suggestions, and probably more than suggestions, that a crime has been committed. He would never have done this unless there were evidence of a crime having been committed, and by Donald Trump and those around him. And similarly, in Watergate, you had the situation where the officials who were fired by the President of the United States had similar beliefs about where the case was going against Richard Nixon and the cover-up.
John, do you believe that just searching for, classified documents that the president may have taken from the White House when he left would be enough for the FBI to decide to do this?
It depends upon the content of the documents. There could be some very seriously compromisable material in national security data, blueprints. Who knows what is there, but there are even documents apparently that are so highly classified that their classification is classified, so they can't even list some of the material that they have acquired in this search. So yes, I think there can be stuff that can affect the United States. It can show sources and methods. National security has long been an area of particular attention, and the National Archives, since the Presidential Records Act, has been very aggressive in going after former staff, never to reach a president before, but former staff or people, very senior political people. Sandy Berger, who was the national security advisor in the Clinton administration, General Petraeus, who was writing a book, they've all experienced what happens if you misuse classified material. And so this is not unprecedented. It has just never reached a president ever abusing his power and taking material like this that we're dealing with.
Yeah, John Dean, Carl Bernstein, thank you.